Trump builds a wall, Biden tries to tear it down, Ron DeSantis sends immigrants to Maryland as a point to left-leaning states to stop letting immigrants into the U.S. If immigration is so polarizing, why do we do it? My name's Chris, and this is the Think Report. Immigration has been a hot topic for the past 10 years. Canada and the US have some of the largest immigration populations in the world, with 21% of Canadians being foreign-born and 14% of Americans. If immigration policy is so polarizing, why do we accept immigration? Well, there are strong arguments on both sides. For the arguments for, it's actually good economic policy, and it's also good to be kind to your neighbors. And the arguments against are the strain on healthcare and the tribalism and racism it creates. Let's take a look at some of those issues. Good economic policy is probably the strongest reason for immigration. Ever since the 1960s, which marks the end of the baby boom era, our native-born population in Canada and the US has been dropping. In this graph, you can see that in 1960, the average household had 3.67 people, and that's been dropping steadily since. The latest figure is 3.15. So how are we going to make up for that difference? We can't have a shrinking population. What'll happen is you'll have a whole bunch of baby boomers and no one to run the economy and run the businesses that support them. In spite of families having fewer children since the 1960s, the US and the Canadian populations actually haven't shrunk. If you look at the graph, the image on the left is the population distribution in 1960. At the top of the graph, you have the elderly, and at the bottom of the graph, you have the young. As you can see, there are very few people who are over the age of 90, and there are a lot of people between the ages of 0 and 4. That's your baby boom. On the graph on the right, you have 2018. At the top, you have folks who are 90 plus, and at the bottom, you have younger folks. You can see the baby boom about 1/3 down the graph. But below the baby boom, you don't have the drop-off you'd expect, knowing that we have shrinking families. So what happened? The reason we don't have the population drop-off that we expected is because Canada and the US are welcoming immigrants to fill in the gap. Without those immigrants, you'd have massive labor shortages and you'd have a tough time maintaining the economy, especially since the baby boomers will retire. So as you're probably getting now, you need younger populations to come in and support the aging demographic. And if you have a large aging demographic, you need an equally large younger demographic to come in and support them. In the next graph, you can actually see the increase in immigration after the 1960s. It grows increasingly, specifically so that it can support the aging baby boomer population. The blue graph represents the portion of the population that is immigrated relative to the total population. And as you can see, that's increasing as well. So to sum it up, in order for Canada and the US to maintain their economy as their population ages, they need a younger population to come in and support it. If we are producing fewer children, we need that younger population to come in from somewhere else. And that's where immigration comes in. The second reason for immigration is just to provide good opportunities to foreigners. Now, if you're a globalist, you believe that all countries have equal opportunity to any country they decide to move to. This has been the heart of the controversy of immigration policy in the US. The Trump wall was a culmination of this, with the far left saying that anyone should be welcome to the US to share in the prosperity and the economic opportunities. However, kindness isn't the best policy. Without proper due diligence in your immigration policy, you end up creating more threats than opportunities for your country. So let me explain what I mean. In order to be a country, you're required to have two things. You need a nationality and you need sovereignty. So a nationality is essentially your culture. In Canada, we have three. We have the Québécois, we have the Aboriginal, and we have the rest of Canada. In the US, I'd say we have two. We have the Spanish-speaking population and we have the rest of the US. So you actually can have multiple nationalities within a country. You also need sovereignty. That's the second part. Sovereignty means being able to protect your borders and protect your population. So in the US, Trump building a wall was a nod to that. You want to be able to protect your population and protect your borders. Otherwise, you have no country. Let's take a look at some of the arguments against immigration. The first one is the strain it has on public services like healthcare, welfare, and policing. According to the Center of Immigration Studies, 63% of non-citizen households access welfare programs, compared to 35% of native households. That's double. However, it's also reasonable. You can't assume that someone's going to be able to immigrate to a foreign country and be able to hit the ground running on day one. You need to find housing, you need to find a job, and you need to know the language. This is just a cost of immigration. The second reason, and probably the strongest, is that immigration fosters tribalism and racism. If you were to ask someone who immigrates to a new country, list the top 5 things that identify you. In the top 5, you'd probably find race or religion. If you're to then ask the same question to someone who is natively born in that country, what things identify you, you probably won't find their skin color or their religion. If you're a minority in a country, you stand out, and you know you stand out. And so those are the things that you use to identify yourself. In addition, we tend to socialize with people who are similar to us. So if you're a 30-year-old, you're more likely to marry a 30-year-old, not a 60-year-old, because you have more in common with that 30-year-old. The same thing goes for race and religion. If you're a particular religion, you're more likely to hang out with people who are also of that religion. Unfortunately, the same thing is for race as well. So what this means is that people will self-group themselves based on race, religion, or the country that they're from. And quite often, if you're from a different country or you have a different religion, you generally have different values as well. And that creates conflict, because if you have one group that has values A and another group that has values B, how do we get along in one country? In addition, we're told that assimilation is bad, and we need to value the differences in different groups. But what if we're told that the differences between these groups also create conflict? The graph below is from HofstedeInsights.com, where they've identified 6 characteristics of different countries: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. We've also graphed China, India, and Mexico against the United States. China, India, and Mexico are the 3 countries that immigrate most to the US. What you'll notice is that there are massive differences in some of these characteristics. So indulgence, for example, Mexico has a 97, whereas China has a 24. Individualism has big differences, and uncertainty avoidance and long-term orientation also has big differences. So this begs the question, how are all of these cultures supposed to get along when all of them are so vastly different? In the past 10 years, we've already seen conflict between different racial and religious groups get worse and worse within US and Canada. With Ibram X. Kendi's book on anti-racism, he proposes that the solution to racism against blacks is to be racist against whites. Now, whether or not you believe that's true or not, what you can't deny is that fosters conflict between 2 different races. In this episode, we covered that good economic policy is the strongest reason for immigration policy, that providing opportunities for foreigners is a major reason for immigration, but sometimes kindness isn't the best policy. We covered the strain on public services like healthcare, welfare, and policing. And finally, we covered immigration and how it creates tribalism and racism in the US and Canada. Whether you're someone who's for or against immigration, you can't ignore that we need it in order to remain competitive economically in the world. The question shouldn't be whether or not we should have immigration. The question should be, how do we make immigration work for us? We created our political systems hundreds of years ago with the goal of freedom. In Canada and the US, it was the land of opportunity. But hundreds of years have passed. I think our goals have changed, and I think our political system needs to change with them. Think about that.